Hi, and welcome to MindSet, an HCD vidcast, where we dive into the world of applied consumer neuroscience and market research with leading experts in the field. My name is Michelle Nagella, PhD in behavioral neuroscience and Director of Research and Innovation at HCD.
And I'm Catherine Ambrose, the Manager of Behavioral and Marketing Sciences with HCD. As your hosts, we are going to act as the buzzkills for the buzzwords, taking time to critically think about the limitations and pitfalls of emerging trends and topics within the field to help you identify what innovation has a lot of untapped potential or is too good to be true.
Now, HCD is a full-service research house which provides research capabilities on consumers by looking at how they perceive, evaluate, and respond to different types of stimuli, such as looking at product experiences, communications, or just general consumer and shopper experiences. We use a combination of tools that come from psychology, physiology, neuroscience, as well as the traditional methods that people typically use to see how they experience different stimuli. That stimuli can range from the early stages of exploration all the way through the final product validation tests. This is what we refer to as applied consumer neuroscience.
So stick around for more curious conversations as we chat our way through the ever-evolving space of consumer science. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of MindSet. It is Catherine Ambrose here with Michelle, as always. And we are so excited today to have a very accomplished scientist in our midst, Rachel Herz. Rachel, can you share a little bit about yourself? You are so accomplished. I know you have a TEDx, that you're a neuroscientist, well published. You're incredible. We're so excited to have you.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what you do.
So, as you already said, I'm a neuroscientist, and my specialty of specialties is the sense of smell. I also generally work on the senses, especially also taste, as you can imagine, since it's connected to smell in terms of our experiences of food, which is another domain that I have a fair bit of research and interest in. And in general, emotion and motivated behavior. So what makes people do what they do and why they do it. So those are sort of my big sort of research questions and interests. And I can talk for hours about anything.
We won't ask you to do that, but I'd love to hear you. So you have a lab where you do a lot of your research. Where are you located?
So I'm located in Rhode Island, but actually I currently don't have my own personal lab any longer other than a virtual one because of my connection to the university has changed over the years. And now I'm just an adjunct. So I typically piggyback in other people's labs when I have a research idea that connects to a collaborator. And so I work together with other people when it comes to actual sort of real sort of wetware as it is. So for instance, I'm doing a neuroimaging study with a colleague at the University of Pittsburgh right now that has to do with smell and looking at how it can help with curbing cravings for cigarettes among smokers. So that's one example. I also collaborate with a couple of other people around the country. So that's where that kind of work gets done. But the work I've done with Martha, for instance, that was work that could be done online and did not require, four walls. So that I can do still.
And we all kind of made that shift, to be honest, right? And at HCD, we don't have a lab per se. We have traveling equipment, right? So totally understand you there. It is a bit freeing that, you could do your research wherever you need to and collaborate with different sort of people, even work with companies, I would assume you can even do.
Yes,
right?
I do a lot of that too. Yeah.
Very cool. And so I'm curious, would you mind taking a step back and telling us what was it that you studied that got you interested in neuroscience, but then even more specifically, what drew you to look into olfaction and, taste and smell?
So I started my undergrad in biology and actually kind of finished with a double major, as it were, in psychology and biology. And at the time when I shifted sort of to take psychology courses, the field of neuroscience didn't exist like it does today. And it was called biopsychology. So working with rats and doing, injecting them with drugs and things like this. So that's what I ended up doing my honors thesis in, an area connected to that. But I decided that I actually didn't really want to work with animals in that way any longer, sort of a little bit of a ethical crisis of conscience, and decided I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. Long story short, I ended up working, when I started my PhD, actually working with animals still, but in this case, now I had switched to birds, and it was much more observational and actually much more like evolutionary ecology. And during that time, I got really good training actually in evolutionary theory, and that has become the backbone for all my thinking about why does this work like this? You know, sort of the just so story. How come we are like that? How come humans behave this way? And so evolutionary theory was really a big part of that training, which then I decided to apply to humans. I realized all the work I'd done with animals was really just as a model system, not really that I care that much. Not that I don't care about birds or rats. They can be very cute and interesting in themselves, but really my underlying interest I discovered was the human application. And so actually, as a little segue to this, I started my real human work in sleep, and I actually still have collaborations with people doing sleep research, which is a completely separate domain. Some of it has overlapped with smell and taste, and some of it hasn't, but sort of a constant, passion of mine throughout my career has also been sleep. But in any case, while I was in my PhD, not doing sleep research or sleeping, I realized I was trying to figure out how to combine biology and psychology in a way that was meaningful and personally interesting to me. And actually, it was reading a paper while I was in graduate school in a course I was taking where the researchers used a smell manipulation to influence mood. So rather than doing the traditional techniques at the time, which were very verbal and kind of contrived, they said, okay, we're going to put this scent in the room, a pleasant scent or an unpleasant scent, and we're going to see how that potentially can influence mood. And then we'll look at the downstream effects. And they had this one little paragraph in their paper about how this was related to the neurophysiology of the brain and neuroanatomy and the sort of evolutionary purposes of the sense of smell. And I'm like, light bulb. So luckily, I had a thesis advisor who basically said, here's the rope, go hang yourself, as opposed to you have to do what I do, which actually was aesthetics. So completely different from what I was interested in, but a very well-rounded, good teacher,
That's a great advisor.
Yeah, definitely. And really encouraged me to sort of go out on my own and figure it out. And actually, that's what I did. Actually, this was at the University of Toronto because I'm Canadian. And I traveled to the US. I actually went to Brown University at that time to meet with who is really the father of the psychological study of smell, Trig Engen, who's unfortunately no longer with us, but he was super generous and kind and gave me this stack of papers and books. And I also went to visit various companies, including International Flavors and Fragrances. I visited labs in Philadelphia, which, and ironically or not, my first academic job was at the Monell Chemical Senses Center in Philly. So that's where it all got started, and the rest is history. I sort of like to call it a circuitous path of least resistance.
Do you happen, I don't want to put you on the spot, do you happen to remember what paper that was? Or who it was?
I do remember. It was a paper by researchers called, their last names were Ehrlichman and Halpern were the two last names. That at the City University of New York was actually where the PI, the sort of main, the other person was a student. So Howard Ehrlichman was faculty there. And I actually also went to see him along my various travels in terms of meeting people. But yes, but he did not stay in that area. So this was just sort of a foray. His primary interest was in sort of mood and memory and a kind of more social psychology and more memory sake level, as opposed to being interested in olfaction per se. But he did do, I think, maybe one other study looking at smell around the similar time frame, but not since then. But yes, it was that paper, and I can't remember the name exactly, but it was something like pleasant and unpleasant odors and mood and memories.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Do you remember what the unpleasant odor was?
No, I have not looked at this paper in quite a long time. I could easily find out though. If
Isn't it fish usually?
That's why I asked, because a lot of the papers we look at, they use orange as the pleasant smell and rotting fish as the unpleasant smell.
I really hope that you're not.
I feel like those might not have been the smells, but I could easily, like, if it's helpful, for later, I can put a link to the paper and for anyone
That'd
who's
be
interested.
interesting. Yeah, and we can always look it up too. But that's a really interesting little path that you took. I love it. And there's so many points that I relate to your journey. You know, I did my postdoc at Monell. You know, I was also really interested in how do you combine biology and psychology. And I was in mine was psychobiology was the department I did my neuroscience degree in, my PhD. And so, yeah, it's really interesting. It's an interesting path we've taken to get here, right? And so I always love to hear people's origin stories. Yeah. So what are some projects? Yeah, go ahead.
Just as another little thing, and maybe you can relate to this too, is that when I was working on my PhD and sort of hit on this, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at the relationship between smell and emotional memory, because actually a part of the story was a question on the GRE exams, which was what sense is most connected to memory, and the answer was smell. And my undergraduate advisor, who, you know, that guy I worked with in the lab with the rats and so forth. And I said, why is that? And he said, I don't know, it just is. And I was like, so unsatisfied with that, like something to do with brain and neuroanatomy. And that always stuck in my mind, like that, I've got to figure that out someday.
I need that answer.
But when I started working on it more specifically, these other faculty members in the department were like, oh no, this is the greatest mistake of your life. Nobody cares about smell. You're never going to get a job.
Wow.
And,
wow.
It was a very negative feedback from the powers.
I'm glad you proved them wrong.
Yeah, that's a really tough thing to decide then for you to decide to kind of go out on a limb anyway.
Yeah, well, I decided, you know, I've sort of had a mantra throughout my life, like if I'm not enjoying it at like a deep level, obviously there's terrible times, you know, with anything, but if it's not fundamentally able to keep me interested and engaged, then it's not worth doing. And I had just been floundering during my PhD enough to know that I actually hit upon something that I really liked. And so I was going to see what happened.
So that's really true.
What would you say then is that fundamental thing that is inspiring you and motivating you to keep in this space?
So I guess I keep on, I mean, one of the interesting things, and I guess which has been good for me from a career perspective, is that I get to be a big fish in a little pond. I mean, so not that many people work on the sense of smell, and an even smaller number, like probably the fewest of all, you know, sort of types of researchers work in the sort of psychological science end of it, as opposed to the molecular biology, the genetics, and that kind of thing. So it's easy to become known, and that's obviously a good thing. And that in and of itself is helpful from my own career perspective. But there's so much that isn't known with respect to the field, and questions which keep on emerging, which are really fascinating. And so it feels like kind of an endless well that can be explored. And so I feel like it's sort of constantly engaging because it's so unsolved. And that's in and of itself really intriguing to me. So
I love that. And especially with, I'm sure there's this newfound appreciation for it the past couple of years now that people have been losing their sense of smell, and they're realizing it on a wide scale for the first time, how important your sense of smell actually is to just enjoying your life and everyday living. I'm curious for our listeners that aren't as familiar, how does your sense of smell actually relate to your emotions? And what do you actually tell people that they don't believe you? They're like, oh, that can't be real. Scent isn't that important. Like, what do you say to like, yes, no, it is.
I don't actually get people usually saying no, no, no. I mean, as soon as I point out how it's connected to their existence, I mean, in ways that they may not have paid attention to, then they tend to realize, oh, okay, wait a second, maybe it is more involved than I had realized before. But I mean, fundamentally, what is so amazing, I mean, the sense of smell has a number of really unique characteristics, and one of them is its neuroanatomy. So the area of the brain that's referred to as the primary olfactory cortex, like where everything is being processed neuronally and coded for conscious olfactory perception awareness, like when we're smelling something and where our consciousness is actually going, oh, that's a lemon. That's actually the same part of the brain where emotion and associative learning and memory are taking place. So it's the amygdala hippocampal complex of the limbic system, and no other sensory system, first of all, co-ops another brain area that has such another major function. Like, for instance, the primary visual cortex, it's for processing, you know, light and other aspects of what our visual system is detecting, not for also, you know, thinking about mathematics, for example. with respect to the sense of smell, this area of the brain really does a completely different job. And yet what I've like to explain to people is fundamentally the job of the sense of smell and the job of emotion is the same, because it's about approach and avoid things that we do to maintain our survival. So get away from things that are bad and approach things that are good for our survival and procreation, et cetera. Sort of, again, going back to that evolutionary
Evolutionary, yeah. And what I think is particularly interesting as far as, your career and the things that you work on is that it's not just the basic research and understanding, but you're also very heavily involved in sort of taking action to help, clinical patients and being involved with different communities. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So actually, this goes back to, well, it first goes back to when I was a postdoc and a woman came to see me. This was at the University of British Columbia, and she'd lost her sense of smell maybe 20 years before. And she was getting to the point where now she couldn't even remember the feelings connected to the smells for things like holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas. And she was really in a bad way emotionally. And that was my first interaction with someone who had acquired anosmia and had, a long duration of life without it, and how she was really suffering. But my biggest sort of first step into that was when I first was working at Brown University after Monell, and someone came to me, actually a lawyer came to me and said, I have a client who lost her sense of smell in a car accident. It was a really bad car accident. Now it's almost 2 years later. Everything physically has been put back together with her, except that she's lost her sense of smell. Seems like it's permanent. And this has really devastated her life.
Yeah.
And I spoke to this woman, interviewed her at great length, and she is still, unfortunately, I guess for her, I suppose, the poster person for all the awful things that can happen with smell loss. And she was someone who, prior to the accident, hadn't given her sense of smell a second thought. Like, she had, one of the reasons why she was so upset was that she had never appreciated what she was getting from her sense of smell at the time. So everything from her emotional life, she was entering a real depression. Her personal life, she felt she couldn't be intimate with her husband any longer. She just was, and had decided that she didn't want to have children. She was like, late 20s, young professional. She couldn't do her work anymore because the cognitive connections to the part of the brain, like the hippocampus, for instance, which is so involved in sort of spatial learning and memory, as well as sort of analytical thinking, she couldn't do that, she felt, any longer. Her whole social life had completely collapsed. Of course, her sense of self had totally collapsed. And absolutely everything. So that really was a kind of stunning moment for me, literally speaking. And it really led me to be very motivated to write my first popular science book, which is called The Scent of Desire, and really about wanting to get people to stop and smell the roses, while they can, and to appreciate all the aspects of existence that sense of smell, gives to you. Because people, when they think of the loss of smell, oh, well, food maybe wouldn't be as good, or I wouldn't be able to smell like the burning something or other, or the gas leak. But those are, relatively speaking, trivial problems when it comes to what smell loss can do. And subsequent to that, I'm on the advisory board of a nonprofit charity in the UK called Fifth Sense, which was the only one in the world that was really dedicated to patient advocacy for people who'd lost their sense of smell and taste. And now there's another one in the United States or North America, STANA, Smell and Taste Association of North America, and I'm also on their scientific advisory board. So, and I do a lot of talking to anosmic groups. And I take this as an extreme compliment, but I sort of also don't know how to take it, that they say of all the people that they've talked to with a sense of smell, that I seem somehow to get it. I sort of know what it's like. So, I don't feel like I really do, but I really appreciate having been told that. Sort of,
I did lose my sense of smell when I had COVID a couple of years ago. And it was really challenging. And I noticed the very moment that it happened, because I recognized my daughter had a dirty diaper, right? I smelled it. I went to change it. And half an hour later, she did it again, and I didn't smell it. Like, it was that quick. It was that gone. And so, it went on for several months. And it really is a thing. And I think a lot of people have come to that understanding. But we also live in a world that's kind of sterile, right? Where people, are buying unscented products. They are living in air-conditioned, sterile environments, and they're kind of missing some of these sensory inputs. What are your thoughts on something like that?
So I do think it's interesting how, what I've always found a little bit fascinating in a way, and this goes into like the use of fragrance products and fine fragrance, is that we spend all this time trying to rid our body of its natural scents and then apply other scents to it. And some perfumers like Tom Ford, for instance, is all about creating like the natural funk of the body, in a bottle that you then put on as sort of like a cosmetic version of it. But I do think that there's an interesting sort of, what would be the right word? The sort of a conflict in a way, but with our relationship with real smells of nature and of human bodies, and then the sanitized version of nature and human bodies. So when we're using an air freshener in our house, for instance, that's recreating a pine forest, I mean, probably, unfortunately, for most of us, we don't live in a pine forest, so we can't get that smell. So yes, I see obviously a reason to want that, but I still feel like there's this sort of the authentic and the non-authentic. And I like the fact that obviously people are trying to scent their environments, whether it's artificial or not. I mean, that is sort of, I don't want to sort of make it seem that that's a bad thing, because I definitely think that's a good thing. But I do think it's interesting how we gravitate in a way towards sort of what is prepackaged for us with respect to that, potentially more than sticking our nose, in the fresh cut grass in the lawn. Like, sort of, I feel like there's this sort of interaction between how much we want to approach it and how much we want it sort of presented to us in a sort of a sanitized and kind of a cosmetic package, as it were, as opposed to.
I guess there's a whole nother realm to that as well. When you think of microbiome and, even, the mother-child dyad and the communication that happens right at birth. I know there's a lot of interest in keeping some of that sensory and developmental aspects of just the natural state in being. Have you, read anything that kind of lends towards that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, absolutely, with respect to sort of the healthy microbiome of the infant, breastfeeding, it sort of creates a better microbiome for the developing child than bottle feeding and so on. And that requires sort of more nose to body contact than a bottle. I mean, so maybe there is a little bit of a connection there. And of course, there's the fascinating research, I'm sure about how newborns can recognize the scent of their mother compared to a mother that's also just given birth, like within an hour or less of contact with her. And mothers can recognize the scent of their newborn in just a few minutes after contact with them. And it's this really deep physical bonding that takes place at a totally sensory level. That's not even a cognitive level. It's just one of the things about the sense of smell is it can exist in pure sensory space. You don't need language. You don't need sort of the cognitive analysis part of it to
it's sort of perceived as being all sorts of other things that you don't need to completely word. I love that. It's very interesting.
So I'm just curious. I want to step in here because I'm always thinking a bit, and we come a bit more from the product space where we're always thinking about that. And we've had that conversation now a bit about unscented and people preferring unscented, but is a product truly unscented, or are they just masking the chemical scents? And then does that influence then their olfaction? Like how does that play into everything?
So there's no such thing as an unscented product. Exactly what you said. There are scents that don't have a specific type of characteristic that someone will go, oh, this is, floral and so forth. But I do have to say that actually the majority of consumers do want scented products. It's actually a minority. I mean, it's a maybe you could call it a large minority if you think like 20% or so, that's not a trivial number of people, but the vast majority of consumers, especially of household products, do want scented. I think it's a little bit different when it comes to, let's say, skincare, especially stuff that you're using on your face, and depending upon what it is, like there is a larger group of consumers that actually don't want scented there. But when it comes to cleaning products, laundry products and so forth, actually
you want to know that it's clean.
Study,
right?
Exactly.
You're talking about those associative effects. And so being able to smell something lemony, then it just signals clean to you, right?
Absolutely. It's a critical signal for the efficacy of the product. And in fact, so important that there are a number of examples that, real data that has shown that people will actually think that the exact same product missing a smell has not delivered on its functional capabilities to the same extent as that product with the scent that the consumer is expecting. So less clothes of a shave, my clothes aren't as clean, whatever the case might be, that it doesn't work as well without the scent signal there. And all the scent is doing is giving you a sign that this is a product that's doing something.
We talk about that a lot with an example we give is Listerine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it doesn't burn, it's not working.
Right? Yeah. These are what's interesting also what you said about association and learning is so the consumers that grew up knowing that it's supposed to burn or that's part of the experience of the product. And so then that comes with, well, then if it's not burning, it doesn't work. Right. But there's a new generation of Listerine users who may never have had that burn. So they don't need that necessarily going forward in order to believe that the product is delivering on its functional benefits. So
which is very interesting. Yes.
On the topic of oral hygiene, I've actually heard a dentist recently share that his big stance is that you actually don't need, in most places in the United States, you don't need toothpaste because of the levels of fluoride in your water, that you're fine just using tap water. And that concept to me just blew. I was like, I would never be okay with, I feel like
it wouldn't feel right.
Right. I need that minty aftertaste.
Yeah,
that's what's conveying that I've brushed my teeth. So it's very interesting how much the sensorial...
Then there's the idea that it's mint, right? Why isn't it cinnamon? Why isn't it vanilla? Right.
Right. Well, that's also a really good point. If you think about also what are the sense of things that are cleaning products versus that you would use, for instance, on your floor versus what you would put in your shampoo, and why, there are these classic sort of categorical differences. And that's also just arbitrarily connected to the way we learn them. And if you look cross-culturally, the scents that are used in cleaning products in different areas around the globe are actually quite different. One great example, I think, is wintergreen mint, which is actually a scent used in toilet cleaning products in the UK. And so there it actually has a really low pleasantness profile and really connected only with actually certain kinds of medicines like medicinal balms and toilet cleaning. And in the US, it's like candy and gum. And total opposite association, but that's arbitrary, completely.
Yeah. So what sort of things are you working on now or in the future that you have interest in?
So the big topic that I'm really interested in these days is the connection between smell and health, and from two perspectives. One, how scents in and of themselves can affect us through the whole sort of associative learning impact, but the immediacy of that emotional response on a whole variety of emotional and cognitive effects, as well as physiological effects, because the mind is so much connected to the body, so that a stressed mental state versus a happy mental state, and so on, and so that interaction between mind and body, that the sense of smell is really the catalyst for. And on the other side of that equation, actually how the sense of smell itself is a bellwether for the functioning and the integrity of the physical body and the brain. And so losing one's sense of smell, not from necessarily an illness related, but let's say just sort of a sudden smell loss, after, let's say, middle age or starting in middle age can, as I'm sure be the signal that appears decades before other neurological diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. It's even connected to MS. There's a whole variety of neurological conditions where smell loss is a very, very early warning signal prior to any of the other manifestations. And then just in and of itself, there's been these amazing kind of large scale community studies where people who are in their 50s and lose their sense of smell are 4 times more likely to die in a 5-year period with all other causes of mortality taken into account than people with a normal functioning sense of smell. And that's just astounding. It's just basically, and I don't think it's because they're sitting in the house where the gas is accumulating and that's the reason why. I think it's because it's really a signal about how healthy your body and your brain are.
Absolutely. That's really interesting. And we take a similar interest in the health benefits and the health connections, the wellness connections with smell, but very much, from working with clients. And so it's certainly something that, CPG companies and flavor and fragrance houses are really interested in as well. And, we'd love to collaborate with you in the future. I'm sure there's plenty to talk about.
Yes, that would be great. That would be great.
There is, but I have one question I want to ask you, and it kind of segued from your last answer before we go into our game. I just wanted to see, while we still have time with you, is there any common misconceptions that you would like to clear up about olfaction, that, it's this myth busting moment for you that you could share with our audience?
Well, one of the things that I get fairly irritated about is, the pheromone thing. So, irritated being a little bit of a strong word, but like the idea that, pheromones, that's sort of where people like to go, depending upon what I'm talking about. And no, there really is very good, clear evidence that there are no pheromonal effects in human interactions. I mean, even the McClintock effect, the female menstrual synchrony effect, looks to be just a total arbitrary wave function,
some sort of statistical thing. Yeah.
That actually gets noticed. It's like, we notice when the waves come in sync, but we don't ever notice when they drift apart naturally.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So that had been for a long time the one sort of exemplar that everyone was like, but what about that? And, it seemed like, okay, maybe there is something to that, but there doesn't seem to be anything to that. And so there is no such thing, in my opinion, as unconscious chemical communication or chemicals that we are communicating through that cannot be perceived through the olfactory system. That's not to say, though, that there are chemicals that we emit that we may not be paying attention to with respect to the other person, but that we are still responding to. And
or that we've lost our ability to do, right? I mean, with all the other, untrue sort of signals that we've put out there.
Right. I mean, so it may be masked.
Right.
I mean, one of the things, though, that I guess this allows me to say is that I don't believe in quote unquote unconscious or subconscious smell processing. I should say subconscious. So if it is below the threshold of detection and or somehow masked by other chemicals, like I really can't smell it even if I were really trying. Because the other thing is when you bring in other chemicals, you're actually going to change the profile. So the mixture is going to be completely different, even though there may have been some, if we took it apart, we might find that original chemical. But if I can't smell it anymore, if it's become diluted and turned into something else, then I don't believe that it's actually influencing me. I think that there are really subtle interactions. I think that there's definitely levels that we're not paying attention to, but I think it has to be conscious perception within that domain anyway, that if you were drawn, focused in on it, you could say, oh yes, I can smell it.
I think we talk about that a lot as well, that perception really is reality. And when people try to separate out, a lot of times they talk about it like system 1 versus system 2. It's not, it's a continuum. You don't recognize it until you pay attention to it. And then it becomes cognition, right? So
there is also a really interesting phenomena related to that, though, and why, humans being so verbal and visually driven, that oftentimes if people don't know what something is, if they don't have a label for it, or even a kind of a concept for a smell, they'll deny that they smell it. They'll say, no, there's nothing there. And yet there is something there, but they say that it's not there because they can't articulate what it is or what it means to them because they've never encountered it before. So that's also something I think is very interesting in terms of the way our perception and our reality combine.
Wow. This is, you have me thinking about everything now, like literally everything. But I do want to get to our game with you because I can't believe we're already at time. It flew with you. You are such a great person to talk to, and we appreciate you coming on the podcast. The game is really quite simple. It's just a free association game where I'm going to say a word to you, and then you just say the first word that comes to your mind. There's no right or wrong answers. Rachel, are you ready?
As ready as I can be. Go for it.
All righty. So the first word, motivation.
Emotion.
Noses.
Well, I feel like this is totally stupid because I'm going to say smell.
No, that's good. It's a good answer. Emotions.
Life.
Olfaction.
Creativity.
Popcorn.
Movie theater.
Stress.
Existence.
Peppermint.
Fulfillment.
Toothpaste,
Cleanliness,
flowers.
love,
That's nice. And then, and then for your last one, bird watching.
outdoors.
Oh, lovely. That was great. You did a great job.
I feel like those though don't do like a Rorschach test of my personality. I felt like it was very free association in a very random way.
Nothing will be held against you, I promise. Oh, but we want to thank you again so much for coming and joining our podcast. How can people reach out to you if they are interested in learning more about your research or just want to get in touch?
So I have a website, www.rachelherz.com, and there's my contact information on that website, and you can find out more about me right through there.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. We really appreciate having you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Till next time.
For more information or updates, follow HCD Research on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at HCD Research Inc. and at HCD Neuroscience. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to rate, review, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you and stay tuned for more curious conversations.